Southwark, just across the river from London, in the spring of 1386. On the rutted road leading out toward Canterbury stands an inn called the Tabard. It is kept by a real man named Henry or Harry Bailey. He is an innkeeper substantial enough to have sat in Parliament, a man large and loud and shrewd, exactly the kind of host who knew that every traveler walking through his door was a purse with legs. Under his roof, on a night much like this one, a sprawling company of strangers gathers before the long ride south. There is a knight, a miller, a cook, a wife from Bath. We know their names and their faces because a poet named Geoffrey Chaucer put them there. But the inn was real, the host was real, and so was the thing that every single one of those travelers understood as they prepared to bed down under a stranger's roof. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. Welcome to History for Sleepyheads. Tonight, we are stepping off the muddy, dangerous roads of medieval Europe and walking through the heavy wooden door of the medieval inn. For a traveler in the 14th century, the inn was a beacon in the absolute blackness of a world lit only by fire. It promised a hearth to dry wet wool. It offered a hot pottage in a trench of bread, a cup of ale to wash the dust from the throat, and the company of other faces glowing in the firelight. But to step inside was to surrender yourself entirely to strangers. For one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. You belonged to the host who poured your drink and tallied your coin. You belonged to the dark, crowded common room where an unmeasured ale might dull your wits. And, most intimately, you belonged to the shared bed, pulling a single woolen blanket over yourself while lying shoulder to shoulder with a traveler whose true name you did not know and whose hand rested inches from his own drawn knife. We remember the medieval tavern through the lens of fantasy and myth. We picture a roaring hearth, overflowing tankards, a fiddler in the corner, and a room erupting in jolly, drunken laughter. But the reality was something quieter, far more necessary, and infinitely more compelling. Most taverns and alehouses were simply ordinary homes, run by ordinary women brewing ale in their kitchens. The great inns were weary places for weary people, heavily regulated by law, policed by the church as chapels of the devil, and watched carefully by tired travelers clutching their purses in the dark. Tonight, we will sit by the dying fire. We will listen to the slow, heavy settling of the house as the night deepens. We will hear the scrape and drop of the door latch as the last weary traveler stumbles in from the cold. The latch lifts, a pause. The latch drops. The road is shut out, and the night begins. Let the fire burn down. Close your eyes and listen. Southwark, just across the river from London, in the spring of 1386. An innkeeper named Harry Bailey, a man substantial enough to represent his borough in Parliament, stands in the courtyard of a sprawling timber-framed establishment called the Tabard. He watches the dazed travelers arrive off the highway, and he measures them with a practiced eye. Listen to what his establishment offered. There were vast stables built to house dozens of horses, complete with ostlers to rub them down and feed them oats. There were great stone hearths burning sea coal and heavy oak. There was food turning on iron spits, a brewhouse churning out fresh ale, and a wide common room where men and women from across the country could sit shoulder to shoulder out of the biting wind. The operation was massive, commercial, and perfectly tuned to extract a margin of profit from every weary soul who crossed its threshold. And the worst part wasn't the cost, or the watered drink, or the heavy taxes the crown placed upon the ale. The worst part is the choice it forced you to make.
To a traveler coming off the road in the last of the light, cold and footsore and afraid, no sight in the medieval world was more welcome than an inn. The smoke rising from its chimney, the glow of firelight at its shutters, the sign creaking over its door to say that here, for a coin, were warmth and food and a bed and the company of other human faces. It was refuge. It was rescue. It was, after a day on a road where robbery and worse were real and constant fears, the very thing a traveler had prayed for since noon. And it was also, of everywhere he might have stopped, the single place he had the most reason to be afraid. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. The medieval road was an isolating, unforgiving place. It was deeply dark. It was cold. It was threaded with outlaws, unmarked bogs, and miles of empty woodland where a traveler caught after sundown might simply vanish into the elements. Against this vast and perilous dark, the inn was a beacon. You would look for the inn sign. It was a painted board or a carved wooden emblem hung high on an iron bracket, swinging out over the dirt road, marking a place of licensed hospitality. That sign, creaking softly in the night wind, meant survival. It meant that tonight you would not sleep in a wet ditch. You pushed the heavy timber door. The latch lifted. A pause. The latch dropped. And with that sound, the terror of the road was shut out. But the room you walked into was rarely the roaring, jolly fantasy tavern of modern film and folklore. The popular image we hold today is a merry, chaotic romp, a roaring fire, flowing tankards, buxom barmaids, a fiddler in the corner, and a loud, brawling crowd of lovable rogues. The reality was a regulated, taxed, morally policed, and faintly dangerous institution that functioned as a cornerstone of medieval trade and survival. To understand the dread and the comfort of this room, we must first separate the myth from the real wood and stone. When we speak loosely of a medieval tavern, we are usually blurring three entirely distinct institutions that served very different purposes and very different classes of people.
First, there was the alehouse. This was not a sprawling, timbered inn, but simply an ordinary peasant house in a rural village. If a woman in the village, and brewing was overwhelmingly women's work, the province of the alewife or brewster, had brewed a fresh batch of ale, she would push a long pole called an ale stake out her front window, or she would hang a bush of evergreen over her door. This signaled to her neighbors that there was drink for sale. There was no dedicated bar. There were no rented beds. You simply walked into a neighbor's kitchen, sat on a rough wooden bench, and paid a penny for a gallon of opaque, low-alcohol ale. It was a place of local gossip and necessity, heavily regulated by the manor court. Second, there was the true tavern. Taverns were urban. They were found in cities like London, York, or Bristol, and their defining feature was not ale, but wine. They were the domain of merchants, guildsmen, and the wealthy, pouring Gascon reds and Rhenish whites from deep, cool stone cellars. They were places of business and sociability, strictly governed by civic laws, where lodging was rarely the primary trade. And finally, there was the inn. The inn was built specifically for the traveler. It was a substantial commercial enterprise situated on a major highway or at a city gate. It offered the three great necessities of the road: stabling for horses, hot food from a central kitchen, and beds for the night. The Tabard in Southwark was an inn, and it is the inn that holds our attention tonight because it was the inn that asked the most of the people who used it. The inn provided a genuine bodily blessing. The fire thawed the mud on leather boots. The pottage, thick with oats, peas, and whatever meat the kitchen could afford, filled a hollow stomach.
The ale, weak and unhopped, tasted of earth and grain and smoke, but it eased the dry throat and calmed the nerves. Yet every single comfort the inn offered carried a shadow. The great inversion of the medieval inn was that the very things that kept you safe were also the things that put you in danger. The inn was open to anyone with a coin. This was its greatest virtue, the promise of the creaking sign above the door. It was also its greatest vulnerability. The open door that welcomed the weary merchant also welcomed the highwayman, the cutpurse, and the desperate. The fire that gathered strangers together for warmth also illuminated the heavy coin purse dangling from a traveler's belt. The ale that loosened tongues and eased the tired mind also made men careless with their secrets and their belongings.
And then there was the bed. To sleep at an inn did not mean renting a private room with a lock on the door. It meant renting a space in a massive wooden frame stuffed with a straw mattress, meant to hold 3 or 4 people at once. You paid your penny, you took off your boots, and you pulled the rough wool blanket up to your chin alongside complete strangers. You did not know their names, you did not know their professions, you only knew that they, like you, carried whatever wealth they owned upon their persons, and that they had knives on their belts. The primary fear of the medieval traveler was not necessarily murder, though that fear lived in the dark corners of the mind. It was theft. It was waking up in the gray light of dawn to find the man who had snored beside you all night was gone, and your purse was gone with him. And what of the host? The innkeeper was a figure of profound ambivalence in the medieval imagination. He fed you, he sheltered you, he protected you from the road, but he also held total authority over you once the sun went down. The legends of the time, and occasionally the grim entries in real coroners' rolls, whispered of innkeepers who were not rescuers, but predators. They spoke of hosts who watered the ale and served foul meat, who rigged the dice in the corner games, or who were in league with local outlaws, noting which travelers carried heavy strong boxes and sending word ahead to the woods. The extreme legends spoke of trapdoors and slit throats, a folklore of murder that would eventually crystallize into the myth of Sweeney Todd and the demon barber. While the daily reality was far more mundane, the fear was entirely rational. You were far from home, sleeping under the roof of a man whose primary interest in you was the silver in your pocket. The laws of the time recognized this unease. Ancient legal codes dictated exactly how long a stranger could stay before the host became legally responsible for their actions. The first night they were an uncouth stranger, the second a guest, and by the third night an agenhine, a member of the household for whom the host must answer. For one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. Even the ale you drank was shadowed by a quiet wariness. It was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was a closely watched, highly taxed, tightly governed system of commerce, where fraud was an everyday reality. In 1266, an English law called the Assize of Bread and Ale fixed exactly what a brewer could charge for a gallon of ale, tying the price directly to the cost of grain. The crown employed officials known as ale conners or ale tasters, men who walked the wards of cities, testing the quality and measure of the drink. Year after year, the manor court rolls are filled with the names of alewives who were fined for selling short measure or foul ale. The numbers tell us exactly how common the cheat was. When you drank in a medieval inn, you drank knowing that the measure might be short, the brew might be thin, and the price might be rigged.
The Church, for its part, viewed the entire institution with deep structural suspicion. To the medieval preacher, the alehouse and the inn were the devil's chapel. If the parish church was the house of God, gathering the community for prayer, sobriety, and salvation, the tavern was its dark mirror. It gathered the community for gluttony, drunkenness, gambling, and idle oaths. It was a place where dice were thrown, a practice the church universally condemned, where men missed evening vespers, and where the strict, God-ordained social order of the day threatened to dissolve in the bottom of an ale pot. The crown regulated its measures, the church damned its soul. Yet, despite the laws, despite the sermons, despite the real and ever-present risk of sleeping beside a thief, the inns were full. The roads were too long and the nights were too cold to do otherwise. The medieval traveler accepted the bargain. They traded the vast, unpredictable danger of the dark woods for the contained, quiet human danger of the shared bed and the locked door. The sign, creaking on its iron bracket, outlived the men who painted it, a permanent marker of this uneasy truce between necessity and fear. The latch lifts, a pause. The latch drops. The night is shut out. The fire settles in the hearth. The shadows stretch long against the heavy timber walls. You sit on a hard wooden bench, holding a wooden cup, listening to the low murmur of tired voices. The men around you are speaking of wool prices, of the weather, of the muddy roads they have just survived. It is warm, it is welcoming, it is deeply peaceful. But beneath the comfort, beneath the wood smoke and the settling ash, there is a quiet, necessary vigilance. From today's view, an inn is just a place to sleep, a quaint relic of a slower time where the beer was warm and the fires were large. From their view, it was a vital, perilous sanctuary, a fragile truce between survival and risk, where you paid a stranger to keep you safe from the dark. And that's what's so chilling.
England, in the late 14th century. The aldermen of a bustling city gather to draft a seemingly mundane piece of legislation. It is an ordinance restricting the length of the poles that project from the front of local alehouses. The law dictates that these poles, known as ale stakes, must not extend more than 7 feet over the king's highway. The lawmakers are frustrated. Without this rule, the heavy wooden poles stretch so far into the narrow streets that they threaten to pull down the timber facades of the houses, or worse, they strike passing riders flush on the head as they navigate the fading evening light. The lawmakers record the restriction, mandate the fines, and move on. But the worst part of the law is not the length of the poles or the heavy fines levied against the alewives who broke the rule. The worst part is what those long, heavy poles were built to signal. No one traveled after dark if they could help it. The roads were bad, the woods were deep, and the dark made them worse. A traveler still out when the light failed was a traveler in real, immediate danger. So the entire shape of a medieval journey bent toward one absolute, non-negotiable goal, reaching shelter before the night. And the sign that shelter was near was, quite literally, a sign. A painted board or a bush of green ivy tied to the end of a long pole hung out over a door to say that here, for a coin, was ale or lodging or both. To a cold and frightened traveler in the last gray light of dusk, that sign was the most beautiful thing on the road. He did not yet know whether the house behind it would be his rescue or his ruin. He only knew it was warm, and it was near, and the dark was coming down. The medieval road dictated the terms of survival, and its primary rule was to leave it before the sun disappeared. As afternoon bled into evening, the psychology of the journey shifted. The steady, measured pace of the morning gave way to a quiet, anxious urgency. The mud in the deep ruts of the highway began to freeze as the temperature dropped. The shadows stretched out from the tree line. The bird song stopped.
The open highway, which at noon had felt like a vital artery of commerce and pilgrimage, transformed into a desolate, threatening expanse. To be caught out of doors when the parish bells rang for vespers was to be exposed to the elements, to the wild dogs, and to the desperate men who made their living in the trees. The road is a subject for another night, for now it is only the perilous freezing void that the traveler was desperate to escape.
The first indication of salvation was usually visual. Literacy was a rare commodity among the common folk of the medieval world, so the landscape of commerce was entirely symbolic. A tradesman did not paint his name above his shop, he hung a carved symbol of his trade. And the sellers of hospitality were no different. For the humble village alehouse, often just a peasant's woman's front room where she sold the surplus of her recent brewing, the signal was the ale stake. It was a long wooden pole jutting horizontally from a window or above a door. Often a bundle of evergreens, known as a bush, was tied to the very end of it. The proverb of the day was, "Good wine needs no bush," meaning a quality drink required no advertising, but in reality, everyone advertised. The ale stake told the weary traveler that fresh ale was available within. It was a beacon of rural hospitality, rustic and deeply local. For the true inn, the substantial establishment built specifically to house travelers, the signaling was more permanent. These houses hung massive painted signs from forged iron brackets. The signs were heavy, expensive, and designed to catch the eye from a quarter-mile down the highway. They bore images that required no letters to understand: a white hart, a blue boar, a golden cross, a swan, a bell. They swung on their iron hinges, groaning softly in the evening wind. In 1393, King Richard II made it a legal requirement for publicans to exhibit signs outside their premises, largely so the official ale tasters could easily identify where brewing was taking place. But to the traveler, the law did not matter. The sign was a promise. It meant that a fire was burning, a pot was boiling, and a roof was waiting. You approached the building. The architecture was imposing, a heavy timber frame filled with wattle and daub, its upper stories jutting out over the street. The windows were small, covered in horn or oiled cloth, glowing with a faint yellow flickering light from within. The cold wind bit at the back of your neck. You stepped up to the threshold. The door was thick oak, studded with iron nails to withstand the very real violence of the world outside. You rested your hand against the rough wood. You pushed your weight forward. The latch lifts. A pause. The latch drops. With that single mechanical sequence of sounds, the vast and terrifying expanse of the medieval night was shut out. The heavy door closed, and the world shrank to the dimensions of a single room. The transition was violent in its suddenness. Outside was the freezing air, the smell of wet earth, and the crushing silence of the road. Inside, you were hit by a physical wall of heat, scent, and sound. The air in the common room was thick, almost chewable. It smelled intensely of wood smoke billowing from a massive stone hearth. It smelled of pottage, a thick simmering stew of oats, peas, and salt pork bubbling in an iron cauldron. It smelled of stale ale soaked into the rushes on the floor. It smelled of unwashed human bodies, of leather tack, and of wet wool garments steaming as they dried nearest the flames. And there was the sound. It was not the roaring, raucous laughter of a tavern brawl. It was a low, steady, exhausted murmur. It was the sound of tired men and women speaking softly over wooden cups, the scrape of a bench on stone, the crackle of the green wood in the fire. It was a room full of people who had survived the day and were now resting in the temporary sanctuary of the light. But crossing the threshold was not merely a physical transition, it was a social and legal submission. As you stood by the door, blinking the smoke from your eyes, you were immediately measured. The host,
The innkeeper or the alewife would look up from their work. Their appraisal was swift, silent, and entirely mercenary. They looked at the mud on your boots to see how far you had walked. They looked at the cut of your cloak to guess your rank. They looked at the leather purse at your belt to estimate your silver. They were calculating what you could pay, what kind of bed you could afford, and whether you would be trouble. And the appraisal went both ways. You looked at the host. You looked at the other travelers clustered around the fire. You looked at the darkened corners of the room and the heavy wooden stairs leading up to the sleeping quarters. You were assessing the safety of the house. You were checking for the subtle signs of a poorly run establishment, or worse, a dangerous one. Was the host overly eager? Were the locals drinking in the corner, eyeing your baggage too closely? This was the unwritten contract of medieval hospitality. You surrendered your autonomy for the night. You handed over your horse to the host's servants. You laid your pack on the host's floor. You trusted the host's lock on the heavy front door. To cross the threshold was to accept a vulnerable dependency. The host was obligated by the ancient customs of hospitality, and increasingly by the common law, to protect you and your goods while you were under their roof. But laws were a fragile shield in the dark. The reality was that from the moment the heavy oak door closed behind you, your safety was entirely in the hands of a person whose name you had not known an hour ago. For one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. This sanctuary, of course, was not a charity. It was a meticulously calculated commercial transaction. Every comfort you experienced in that warm, smoky room came with a price, weighed in hammered silver pennies. The economics of the medieval inn were rigid and closely monitored by both the host and the crown. If you were a laborer or a poor pilgrim, you might only afford to stop at a humble village alehouse, paying a halfpenny for a gallon of thin, cloudy ale, and begging a corner of the floor or the barn to sleep in for another fraction of a coin. But if you were a merchant, a pardoner, or a tradesman stopping at a proper inn like the Tabard, the costs accumulated quickly. A hot meal from the kitchen, perhaps a piece of roast meat or a bowl of thick stew, might cost a penny or two. A gallon of stronger ale was another penny. A space in a shared bed, complete with straw mattress and coarse wool blankets, cost a penny per night. Interestingly, the most expensive part of the stay was rarely the human accommodation. It was the stabling. A traveler's horse was their livelihood and their only means of escape, and caring for it was paramount. Buying oats, hay, and a stall in the inn's outbuildings could easily cost twice as much as the rider's own bed and board. The host knew this, and the profit margins on horse fodder were notoriously steep, heavily regulated by local courts, but constantly abused by sharp innkeepers. You handed over your silver pennies, often physically cut into halves or quarters to make small change, and in return, you bought your life for the night. This transaction underpinned everything. The warmth was real, the food was hot, and the walls were thick, but none of it was freely given. It was an industry built on the vulnerability of the traveler. Yet despite the calculated extraction of your coin, and despite the wary glances exchanged over the rims of wooden cups, the overwhelming sensation upon arriving at an inn was profound gratitude. The inn provided the simple, irreducible shelter of the roof. It brought you in out of the dark. It placed a physical barrier of oak and iron between you and the freezing, lawless expanse of the open road. It allowed you to unbuckle your wet cloak, sit near a burning fire, and feel the terror of the journey slowly drain from your muscles. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. You had arrived. You had survived the day. The night ahead held its own quiet dangers, the watered drink, the watchful host, the armed strangers who would soon share your mattress. But those were terrors for later hours. For now, in the immediate aftermath of the arrival, there was only the heat of the fire on your face, the smell of the cooking pot, and the heavy door bolted firmly against the dark. From today's view, checking into a room for the night is a mundane administrative task, a brief exchange of a credit card for a plastic key card before riding an elevator to a private silent suite. From their view, entering an inn was a profound act of submission, a literal stepping out of the fatal wilderness and into a precarious, paid-for sanctuary where your life depended entirely on the honesty of a stranger. And that's what's so chilling. England throughout the 14th century. At the center of the inn, as at the center of almost every medieval building, was the fire. And over the fire, suspended on an adjustable iron hook or a heavy chain, hung a pot. And in the pot, more often than anything else, was pottage. It was the absolute dietary foundation of the medieval world, a thick, slow-simmered mixture of grains, pulses, and vegetables, kept going over the fire and ladled out to whoever paid. To a traveler who had walked since dawn on an empty stomach, cold to the bone, the smell of that pot as he came through the door was very close to the smell of salvation. He sat on a bench. He took off his wet cloak. He waited for a wooden bowl. And the worst part wasn't the coarse bread, or the thin ale, or the smell of wet wool. The worst part was that this, the fire and the pot, was often the safest, most comfortable hour of the entire night. To understand the profound relief of this moment, we have to look closely at the hearth. The fireplace in a substantial inn like the Tabard was not a decorative feature tucked into a corner. It was massive, often built of stone, and it dominated the common room. In older or humbler establishments, the fire might still have been laid on a central hearth in the middle of the floor, the smoke drifting upward toward a louvered hole in the roof. Whether central or set against a wall, the fire was the beating heart of the house. It provided the only source of heat against the bitter cold. It provided the only substantial light once the sun went down, casting long, flickering shadows against the timber beams. And, crucially, it was the only engine of cooking. When you stepped in from the dark, the first imperative was bodily warmth. You moved toward the hearth. You found a space on a rough wooden bench beside other silent, exhausted travelers. You extended your hands toward the flames. The heat was fierce and immediate. It began to thaw the numb fingers. It baked the mud on your leather boots until it flaked away. It met the damp wool of your cloak and your tunic, and soon the air around the hearth was thick with the smell of wet wool steaming dry. The ache slowly went out of your legs. The physical terror of the road began to recede, replaced by a deep, heavy lethargy. The fire warmed you, the bench took the weight of the road off your feet, and the scrape and drop of the door latch sounded behind you, over and over, as more travelers arrived out of the dark, shutting the cold night out. Then came the food. The popular image of a medieval tavern feast usually involves a groaning wooden board piled high with whole roasted pigs, capons, and overflowing tankards. The reality of everyday inn fare was entirely different and far more practical. The inn was feeding a constant, unpredictable stream of people. The solution to this logistical problem was the pot.
Pottage was the ubiquitous dish of the age. It was not a specific recipe, but a method. It was a thick stew or porridge, constantly simmering, constantly replenished. At its most basic, In a rural alehouse, it might be little more than oats or barley boiled in water with some peas and beans, seasoned with whatever herbs grew by the back door, parsley, sage, or garlic. In a wealthier inn, the pot was richer. It might contain a base of meat broth, chunks of salt pork or bacon, onions, leeks, and perhaps some saffron or pepper if the host was catering to merchants. It was ladled out thick, hot, and filling. It was designed to provide cheap, dense calories to bodies that had burned them away on the muddy roads. The accompaniment was bread. Bread was the other great staple, consumed in massive quantities. Its quality was a direct indicator of wealth and status. A poor traveler at a village alehouse would be served coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, heavy and dense. A wealthier merchant at a town inn might purchase bread made from maslin, a mix of rye and wheat, or even a finer, whiter wheat loaf. The bread served a dual purpose. It was sustenance, and it was often a tool. In many settings, a thick slice of stale, coarse bread known as a trencher was used as a plate. The pottage was ladled directly onto it, or the trencher was used to soak up the rich broth from the bottom of a wooden bowl. When the meal was finished, the gravy-soaked trencher was either eaten by the diner, given to the poor at the door, or thrown to the dogs in the yard. You took the wooden bowl from the host. You broke the coarse bread. You felt the weight of the hot pottage in your hands. The first mouthful was dense with the taste of oats, salt, and smokewood. It was not a feast, but it was exactly what a cold body required. It filled the hollow stomach. It stopped the shivering. It was a genuine bodily mercy freely sold to anyone with a coin. For this one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn, and for this 1 hour by the fire, that belonging was a comfort. With the food came the first cup of drink. Ale was the everyday beverage of the medieval world, consumed by everyone from laborers to children, morning, noon, and night. It was made from malted barley or oats, water, and yeast. Crucially, the ale of this period was unhopped. It did not yet contain the bitter, preserving hops that would later define beer. Because it lacked hops, medieval ale spoiled quickly. It had to be brewed constantly, and it had to be drunk fresh. The host would set a wooden cup or a leather jack on the table before you. The ale inside was opaque, often slightly sweet and thick with sediment. It tasted of the grain it was made from and the smoke of the brewhouse fire. The alcohol content of this everyday small ale was relatively low, meant to hydrate and provide calories rather than to intoxicate.
You took the first drink. The liquid was cool, a sharp contrast to the heat of the fire and the hot pottage. It washed the dust of the road from your throat. It settled the nerves. The combination of the heavy food, the weak alcohol, and the fierce heat of the hearth created a profound physical sedation. You sat back on the bench. You listened to the settling crack of the hearth fire. You listened to the low voices of the men and women beside you. For this brief window of time, the inn was simply the best place in the world. This was the innocent heart of the institution. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. But in this first hour the fear was suspended. The fire and the pot delivered exactly what they promised. They offered a temporary reprieve from the brutal physics of medieval travel. They gave back the warmth the wind had stolen. They replaced the terrifying emptiness of the dark woods with the contained, predictable comfort of a hot meal. But as the evening wore on, the nature of the room would subtly shift. The pottage bowls would be cleared away. The travelers would linger over a second or third cup of ale.
The quiet exhaustion of arrival would give way to the low, wary sociability of strangers trapped in a room together. The host would begin to tally the bill, the laws that governed the measure in your cup and the people who sat beside you on the bench would begin to matter. The fire would slowly burn down to glowing ash, signaling the approach of the deep night and the shared bed that waited in the dark upstairs. But for now, there is only the heat on your face, the smell of the cooking pot, and the heavy door bolted against the wind. From today's view, a bowl of plain porridge by a smoky fire and a cup of warm, cloudy ale looks like a meager, unappetizing ration. From their view, it was warmth and food and salvation at the end of a dangerous day. And that's what's so chilling.
Southwark, the spring of 1386. On the road out of London toward Canterbury stands a sprawling, timber-framed inn called the Tabard. It is kept by a real man named Henry Bailey, known to history and to his neighbors as Harry. He is an innkeeper, and by the surviving records of the 14th century, a substantial one. He pays his taxes. He represents the borough of Southwark in Parliament. He is a master of logistics and a judge of men, a host who knows, better than anyone, that every weary traveler crossing his threshold is a purse with legs and a mouth to be fed. On this particular spring night, his inn fills with a company of strangers bound for the shrine at Canterbury, a knight, a miller, a cook, a wife from Bath. We know them because a poet named Geoffrey Chaucer put them there, in the most famous opening in English literature. But the inn was real, the host was real, and the worst part isn't the fiction or the poetry or the centuries that separate our world from theirs. The worst part is the underlying absolute truth of the situation Chaucer described. To understand the emotional core of the medieval inn, we have to look past the institution and look at the people. We have to turn the camera around, moving away from the abstract laws and the lumbering timber, and settle inside one real documented house on one real night. Because behind every painted sign and every boiling pot of pottage was a real room full of breathing, exhausted people. And nowhere is that human reality clearer than at the Tabard. The geography of this specific inn is vital. Southwark in the 1380s was not London. It sat on the south bank of the River Thames at the foot of London Bridge, physically and legally distinct from the strict, heavily policed jurisdictions of the city. Southwark was the great funnel of southern England. It was a place of theaters, of brothels known as the stews, of prisons, and, above all, of massive commercial inns. If you were leaving London for the continent, for the southern ports, or for the great pilgrimage roads into Kent, you started here. The Tabard was one of the largest and most prominent of these hostelries. It was a vast complex built around a central open courtyard, lined with wooden galleries that gave access to the sleeping quarters above, with deep cellars below, and extensive stables out back. The man who ran it, the historical Henry Bailey, was not a lowly servant or a romantic tavern keep wiping down a bar. The records of the age show him as a man of property and standing. He was a tax collector, a subsidy controller, and a member of Parliament for Southwark in 1376 and 1378. Running an establishment the size of the Tabard required the skills of a modern logistics director. He managed a small army of ostlers, tapsters, chamberlains, and cooks. He bought hay by the cartload, wood by the ton, and ale by the barrel. But above all, he managed people. He had to assess in a single glance at a rain-soaked rider whether that man could pay for a private chamber or belonged on the floor by the fire. He had to know who was carrying silver, who was carrying a concealed blade, and who was likely to slip out before dawn without paying the reckoning.
He was the absolute ruler of his small wooden kingdom.
Through the late afternoon and into the evening, the travellers arrived. They came over the bridge from London, or up the muddy roads from the countryside. The latch lifts. A pause. The latch drops. With every swing of the heavy oak door, the Tabard took another stranger in out of the dark. And this is where the genius of Chaucer's text serves as a perfect mirror for the historical reality. The Canterbury Tales is a literary work, not a historical transcript of events. The Knight, the Miller, and the Pardoner are fictions, but Chaucer used the Tabard, and he used Harry Bailey because his 14th century audience knew exactly what a night at a great inn felt like. He used the inn because it was the only plausible setting in the medieval world where such a drastically varied group of people would ever sit in the same room. Outside the walls of the inn, the medieval world was rigidly, fiercely stratified. A wealthy landowner did not break bread with a miller. A knight did not share a fire with a cook. A wealthy cloth merchant did not drink from the same cup as a poor rural parson. Sumptuary laws dictated exactly what fabrics they were legally permitted to wear. Deeply ingrained social customs dictated who they could speak to and how they must bow when they did. The hierarchy was believed to be ordained by God, static and absolute. But the road and the inn at the end of it forced a temporary, fragile suspension of that order. The inn was a bottleneck of survival. There were only so many benches by the roaring sea-coal fire. There were only so many bowls of hot pottage to be ladled out. When the sun went down and the dark pressed against the shuttered windows, necessity stripped away the luxury of class division. You walked in from the cold. You took off your dripping cloak. You found an empty space on a bench near the hearth, and you sat down. You looked to your left, and there was a merchant counting his coins. You looked to your right, and there was a mercenary soldier staring quietly into the flames. You were a company of strangers thrown together by the arbitrary timing of your journeys. For one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. The host moved among you. He brought the ale. He settled disputes. He kept the peace in a room full of tired, armed men who owed no allegiance to one another. Under his roof, his word was the law. You ate his food. You drank his drink. You submitted to his authority because the alternative was the freezing, lawless expanse of the road outside. This forced proximity provided one of the most profound, undocumented mercies of the medieval world, the human warmth of the company of strangers. Travel was an intensely isolating experience. The woods were empty. The bogs were silent. A traveler alone on the road was entirely vulnerable to his own fears. But inside the Tabard, surrounded by the low hum of voices, the crackle of the fire, and the smell of wet wool and roasting meat, that isolation vanished. The people beside you might be dangerous, they might be thieves, but they were human. They were other living faces in the light, talking of the weather, of the wool prices, of the condition of the road ahead. They were a defense against the vast, crushing loneliness of the medieval night.
Yet this exact comfort was simultaneously the source of the dread. The inn forced you to trust people you had every reason to suspect. The reality of the Tabard, and of every inn across Europe, was that the social leveling of the hearth eventually extended to the sleeping quarters. When the fire burned down and the host called for the reckoning, that mixed company of strangers would walk up the wooden stairs in the dark. They would be directed into shared chambers, and they would climb into massive straw-stuffed beds, 3 or 4 to a mattress. The wealthy merchant would lie down next to the soldier. The honest pilgrim would pull the wool blanket over his shoulder beside a man whose name he did not know and whose intentions he could only guess. Even at the Tabard, even under the watchful, documented eye of a respectable member of Parliament like Harry Bailey, the fundamental dynamic of the inn remained unchanged. You fell asleep with your hand resting softly on the leather purse at your belt. You closed your eyes in a room full of men who carried knives. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. Chaucer captured the brilliance, the colour, and the talk of this gathering, cementing the Tabard into the cultural memory of the world. But for every Tabard, there were 1,000 nameless, unrecorded inns on 1,000 muddy roads. For every Harry Bailey, there were 1,000 ordinary hosts and alewives whose names were never written down, except perhaps in the margins of a manor court roll for selling a short measure of ale. The Tabard allows us to see them. It is the emotional peak of our understanding because it gives us a real house on a real night where the abstract machinery of hospitality became flesh and bone. Behind the heavy oak doors, in the flickering light of the fire, they were not historical figures or literary archetypes. They were just tired people. They were cold. They were hungry. They were wary of the man sitting next to them, and they were profoundly grateful for the roof over their heads. They sat listening to the wind rattle the shutters. They drank the thin ale. They watched the host move through the shadows, tallying his silver. They felt the ache in their legs from the miles they had walked, and they felt the quiet, steady anxiety of the miles they still had to walk tomorrow. They were strangers, bound together for a few dark hours by nothing more than the desperate shared need to be warm. From today's view, the gathering at the Tabard Inn is a piece of classic literature, a quaint and colorful framing device for a book of medieval poetry. From their view, it was the absolute unvarnished reality of survival on the road, a real night under a real roof where you trusted your life to a stranger because the dark left you no other choice. And that's what's so chilling.
England, in the year 1266, a sweeping piece of royal legislation called the Assize of Bread and Ale is set down in law. Its purpose is entirely practical, to regulate the price, weight, and quality of the two absolute staples of the medieval English diet. The law dictates that the price of a gallon of ale must be strictly tied to the current market price of wheat, barley, and oats. If grain is cheap, ale must be cheap. If the brewer breaks this rule, they face a rising scale of punishments. The first offense brings a fine. The second offense brings a larger fine. But if a brewer repeatedly sells short measure or foul drink, the law prescribes physical humiliation. They are to be placed in the pillory or upon the tumbrel, exposed to the anger and the mockery of their neighbors. The authorities did not enact these laws because they were quaintly obsessed with brewing. They enacted them because ale was the caloric engine of the workforce. And the worst part isn't the severity of the punishment or the endless fines recorded in the manor courts. The worst part is what those endless fines tell us about the drink in the traveler's cup. The drink in the traveler's cup was ale, and ale was the most important beverage in the medieval world. It was brewed in ordinary houses, predominantly by women, and it was consumed by everyone from the oldest laborer to the youngest child, at every meal and between them. It was food as much as it was drink. But precisely because it mattered so much, it was watched. Where there's a product that everyone must buy, there is always someone selling it short. And the court records of the Middle Ages tell us, in fine after fine after fine, exactly how often they did. To understand the drink by the fire, we must walk through the mechanics of how it was made, how it was policed, and what it actually was. The popular image of a medieval tavern often involves flowing tankards of strong, frothy beer and a nation perpetually inebriated. The reality was far more sober and far more regulated. First, a crucial distinction must be drawn. The drink served in the tavern and in thousands of rural alehouses through the 14th century was ale. It was brewed from malted grain, usually barley, sometimes oats or wheat, water, and yeast. Crucially, it did not contain hops. Beer, which is brewed with the bitter preservative flower of the hop plant, was a later arrival in England, brought by Dutch and Flemish immigrants, roughly in the 15th century. Because it lacked the preservative qualities of hops, medieval ale spoiled very quickly. It would turn sour in a matter of days. This meant it could not be brewed in massive centralized factories and shipped across the country. It had to be brewed constantly, locally, and in small batches. This necessity dictated who made it. Brewing was almost entirely a domestic industry, and it was overwhelmingly women's work. The women who brewed were known as alewives or brewsters. In many villages, an alewife would brew a batch, keep what her family needed, and hang an ale stake out her window to sell the surplus to her neighbors or to passing travelers. In a large commercial inn, the brewing might happen in a dedicated outbuilding on a larger scale, but the principle remained the same. The drink was local, fresh, and highly perishable.
It was also, for the most part, relatively weak. The first extraction from the malt yielded a strong, potent ale, often reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. But the grain was then washed a second or even a third time, producing a much weaker beverage known as small ale. This small ale was the everyday drink of the medieval world. It was opaque, slightly sweet, and its alcohol content was low enough that a laborer could drink it throughout a long day in the fields without losing his footing. It provided hydration, vital calories, and a small degree of comfort. It is a common modern assumption that medieval people drank ale exclusively because the water was lethally polluted and they were terrified to drink it. This is a vast oversimplification. Medieval people did drink water. They drank from springs, from deep wells, and from rivers they judged to be clean. They knew perfectly well the difference between a clear spring and a stagnant ditch. But water offered no calories, and it offered no comfort. Ale provided both. It was the dietary and social staple of the age, deeply ingrained in the culture and the economy. Because it was a staple, the crown and the local lords watched it closely. The Assize of Bread and Ale of 1266 was the foundational law, but its enforcement fell to local officials. Every borough and nearly every rural manor court appointed officers specifically tasked with policing the trade. These men were known as ale tasters or ale conners. The ale taster was not a ceremonial role. It was a serious working position. When an alewife finished a new brew, she was legally required to send for the ale taster before she could sell a single drop. The officer would arrive at the house. He would taste the ale to ensure it was of good estate and not foul or spoiled. But more importantly, he would test the measure. He checked the wooden cups, the leather jacks, and the iron-bound buckets the alewife used, ensuring they conformed to the official, standard measurements of the realm. A sealed, official gallon measure was often kept at the local guildhall or church, and the ale taster's job was to ensure the alewife's cups matched it. They walked the streets, they checked the seals, they tasted the brew. They were the medieval equivalent of trading standards officers, attempting to impose order on a chaotic, decentralized industry. And they were constantly, overwhelmingly busy. The surviving rolls of the manor and borough courts are filled page after page, year after year, with fines levied against alewives and innkeepers for breaking the assize. They were fined for brewing without a license. They were fined for selling ale before the ale taster had checked it. They were fined for selling ale that was sour or foul. But the most common offense, the great quiet dishonesty of the medieval inn, was the short measure.
Hosts would subtly alter their serving vessels. They would use cups with excessively thick bottoms, so a pint looked like a pint from the outside, but held significantly less liquid within. They would serve the ale before the foam had settled, ensuring the customer paid for froth rather than drink. Or they would simply water the ale down in the cellar, stretching the barrel meant for 10 men to serve 15.
The fines were so frequent that in many jurisdictions they functioned less as a deterrent and more as a de facto licensing fee, a tax the alewives paid to the local lord for the privilege of continuing their trade. But to the traveler sitting by the fire, the short measure was a real, immediate theft. It was the first and most common way the inn exploited you. You handed over your hard-earned silver penny, you took the wooden cup, you drank the ale, and you knew, because everyone knew, that the cup was likely short and the drink was likely thin. But you drank it anyway, because you were cold, and because the host held the key to the door, and because the alternative was nothing at all. This is the great quiet contradiction of the inn. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. The fear was not always a knife in the dark. Often it was simply the steady, systematic extraction of your coin by a host who smiled at you while he served you a false measure. For one night under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn, and part of belonging to the inn was accepting the terms of the trade. The scrape and drop of the door latch sounds again. Another traveler arrives. The host moves to the barrel, fills another cup, and walks it to the fire. The law of the land stands behind the measure, and the quiet theft continues beneath the law. From today's view, the regulation of ale looks like a quaint, bureaucratic footnote in the history of beer, a funny story about thick-bottomed cups. From their view, it was the state attempting to guard the one essential commodity no working person could live without, fighting a daily losing battle against the people who poured it. And that's what's so chilling. England, the late 14th century. A prominent Dominican friar named John Bromyard takes up his quill to compile a massive manual for preachers, the Summa Predicantium. It is a sprawling, encyclopedic text designed to provide the clergy with the moral arguments they need to save the souls of ordinary people. When Bromyard turns his attention to the alehouse and the inn, he does not describe them as places of hospitality or necessary refuge. He describes them as the direct structural enemy of God. Listen to what he writes. He says that the tavern is the devil's church. He says that just as God has his chapel where men go for salvation, the devil has his tavern where men go for damnation. He lays out the dark mirror of the institution, where the church has holy water, the tavern has watered ale. Where the church has hymns, the tavern has idle songs. Where the church has the altar, the tavern has the hearth. And the worst part isn't the preacher's fiery rhetoric or the heavy moral weight placed upon a simple room. The worst part is that Bromyard was entirely correct about the power of the place. For most people in the medieval world, the inn or the alehouse was the only place they ever met a stranger. It was where the news came in off the road, carried by travelers from places most villagers would never see. It was where a bargain was struck, a song was learned, and a game of dice was thrown by the fire. It was, for a great many people, the warm center of the whole social world, the one place that was neither the church, nor the field, nor the home. And that is exactly why the church distrusted it. Because a place where strangers gathered, and ale flowed, and dice were thrown, and voices were raised in song, was not merely a comfort to the tired traveler, it was competition. To understand the company by the hearth, we have to recognize the profound isolation of the medieval landscape.
The overwhelming majority of the population lived rural, agrarian lives, bound to a manor or a village, intimately familiar with a radius of perhaps 15 or 20 miles. Information traveled at the speed of a walking horse or a walking man. There were no broadsheets. There was no postal service for the commoner. The world was vast, silent, and disconnected. Into this silence, the inn acted as a vital, localized receiver. It was the medieval internet of the road. When you sat on the rough bench by the hearth, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and damp wool, you were not just warming your bones, you were tapping into the only communication network available. The traveler sitting across from you might be a wool merchant from York, a pardoner down from London, or a mercenary returning from the continent. Through them, the wider world filtered into the room.
The exchange was quiet and deliberate. The news was spoken in low voices over wooden cups. Men talked of the weather, of the condition of the muddy roads, of the price of grain in the next county. They spoke of the changing taxes levied by the crown, of peasant uprisings, of the plague creeping into a distant port. A village learned what was happening in the kingdom because a traveler stopped at the local alehouse to drink a penny gallon of small ale and left a story behind. The inn was a place of intellectual and social friction, where the rigid, isolated bubbles of medieval life briefly overlapped. And with the news came the entertainment. The popular myth of the tavern envisions a raucous, roaring hall, with a fiddler jumping on tables and the whole room linking arms in drunken song. The reality was much smaller, much quieter, and far more human. In a world largely without books, entertainment was oral. A traveler might recite a poem or a fable. A song might pass from one mouth to another, not a shouted drinking anthem, but a quiet, unaccompanied ballad about an outlaw in the woods or a saint's miracle, sung by the fire while the listeners rested their tired legs. It was a simple, profound exchange of culture, carried on the breath of strangers. The latch lifts. A pause. The latch drops. With every opening of the door, the room gathered a little more of the world, and as the evening deepened, the business of the inn expanded beyond survival and talk. It turned to commerce and to play. The inn was a vital hub of local trade. If a farmer wanted to sell a surplus horse or a merchant wanted to strike a deal for a load of timber, they did not meet in an office. They met at the inn. The bargain was negotiated by the fire, and it was invariably sealed with a drink, a custom so entrenched it was often legally recognized. The physical space of the inn was a neutral ground, heavily trafficked and highly visible, making it the perfect civic arena for the unwritten contracts of ordinary men. And then there were the games. On a small wooden board near the fire, a pair of dice would rattle and drop. The dice were small, usually carved from bone or antler, their pips drilled and darkened with ash. Later in the period, rudimentary playing cards would begin to appear, but for most of the Middle Ages, dice were the ubiquitous game of chance. They passed the slow, dark hours between the end of the meal and the extinguishing of the candles. They were played for small stakes, a few pennies, or the price of the next round of ale. It was a quiet, almost hypnotic sociability. It was the very human warmth of the company of strangers, offering a brief, vital defense against the crushing loneliness of the road. But every one of these comforts, the news, the talk, the song, the game, carried a heavy moral shadow. To the men who preached on Sundays, the inn's sociability was not a mercy. It was a profound spiritual danger. The medieval church viewed the tavern through a lens of absolute structural suspicion.
The Devil's Chapel was not merely a colorful turn of phrase, it was a deeply felt theological stance. The church demanded total spiritual attention. The Sabbath was meant for Mass, for quiet reflection, and for the rigid observance of God's order. The inn offered an intoxicating alternative.
The preachers condemned the alehouse because it was the site of gluttony and drunkenness, the deliberate dulling of the God-given senses. But their anger went much deeper than the ale. They condemned the gossip because idle talk led to slander, and slander was a sin against charity. They condemned the singing because secular songs turned the mind away from the hymns of salvation and toward the desires of the flesh. They fiercely, universally condemned the dice. To the medieval moralist, gambling was an affront to divine providence. It replaced God's will with blind, chaotic chance, and the frustration of losing inevitably provoked swearing and blasphemy, the casual taking of the Lord's name in vain over a piece of carved bone. Moreover, the inn threatened the social fabric itself. By gathering strangers together in the dark and loosening their tongues with weak ale, the inn fostered a dangerous equality. In the church, the social hierarchy was physically manifested. The lord sat in the front, the peasant stood in the back. But at the inn, the men sat shoulder to shoulder on the same rough bench, sharing the same fire, throwing the same dice. It was a space that temporarily dissolved the strict God-ordained order of the world, and in that dissolution, the authorities saw the seeds of rebellion, heresy, and sin. This was the great counterintuitive tension of the medieval inn. The very things that made it a comfort were the things that made it a threat. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. The fear was not always the physical danger of the highwayman. It was the moral danger of the room. You came in for the heat of the fire and the shelter of the roof, but in doing so, you placed yourself in the Devil's Chapel, surrounded by the temptations of the flesh and the suspect company of men you did not know. Yet the travelers stayed. They listened to the news. They watched the dice roll. They drank the ale. The profound human need for connection, for warmth, and for a voice in the dark was stronger than the fear of the pulpit. For one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. You belonged to its talk, to its games, and to its quiet, necessary sins. The fire slowly settled in the hearth. The talk began to fade as exhaustion overtook the room. The host began to move among the benches, quietly calculating the reckoning. The sociability of the evening was drawing to a close, making way for the deep night and the final, most vulnerable transaction of the stay. From today's view, a quiet drink and a game of dice with strangers is the definition of harmless, ordinary leisure. From their view, it was a precarious gathering in a morally suspect room, a place where the warmth of human company brushed dangerously close to the fire of damnation. And that's what's so chilling.
England, the late 14th century. The register of the manor court in a small provincial town records the mundane business of the season. Amid the disputes over stray cattle and unkept fences, a man named Thomas is fined. His offense is not violence, nor is it theft. He is fined because the servant he employs to manage the stables at his inn, the ostler, has been caught overcharging travelers for oats and hay. Thomas pays the fine, a matter of a few pence, and returns to his establishment. He does not fire the ostler. He simply factors the cost of doing business and instructs the man to be more careful next time. The court record is brief, dry, and entirely ordinary. But the worst part isn't the petty corruption or the ease with which the fine was paid. The worst part is what that small, overlooked entry reveals about the warm room the traveler was sleeping in. To the traveler, The inn was hospitality, a warm welcome, a hot fire, and a rest at the end of a hard day. To the people who kept it, the inn was work, and it never really stopped. The warmth the guest felt was, for all of them, simply the day's labor. To understand the machinery of the inn, we must look past the fire and the ale and look at the hands that provided them. A busy medieval inn was a complex, profit-driven enterprise running late into the night and starting again long before dawn. At the center of it stood the host. The innkeeper was a figure of vital, practical authority. A man like Harry Bailey of the Tabard was the master of the house, a cook, a judge of character, and above all, a keeper of accounts. The medieval host had to possess a profound, almost instinctual understanding of human nature and economics. When a traveler crossed the threshold, the innkeeper read them instantly. He assessed the quality of their cloak, the mud on their boots, and the weight of the purse at their belt. He knew who could be charged a premium for a private chamber, who belonged on a pallet near the fire, and who was likely to cause trouble when the ale ran out. The hospitality he offered was genuine in its execution. The fire was real, the food was hot, but it was underpinned by a cool, constant commercial calculation. He moved among the benches, smiling, pouring, listening to the news of the road, while his mind endlessly tallied the silver. He was the absolute ruler of his small kingdom, and you had to trust him, because for one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. He held your purse's safety, your ale's honesty, and your night's peace entirely in his hands. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. But the host did not run the house alone. Behind the heavy wooden door leading to the kitchens and the cellars, a whole household labored to keep the fire burning.
Crucial to the entire operation, and often the true engine of the inn's profit, was the brewing. And as we have seen, the brewing was overwhelmingly women's work. In many inns, the alewife was the host's wife, or a senior woman of the household. She managed a delicate, relentless cycle of production. Because the unhopped ale spoiled so quickly, she was constantly malting grain, boiling water, pitching yeast, and watching the fermentation. She worked in the hot, sweet-smelling, smoke-filled outbuildings, producing the gallons of small ale that fueled the common room. Her labor was the absolute foundation of the inn's economy. Without a steady, fresh supply of ale, the house would fail. Below the host and the alewife was a hierarchy of servants whose names rarely made it into the historical record, except when they were caught, like Thomas's ostler, breaking the law. There was the chamberlain, the servant responsible for the sleeping quarters upstairs. He carried the rushlights. He saw that the straw mattresses were turned and that the rough wool blankets were folded. He directed the weary travelers to their shared beds, packing 3 or 4 strangers into a single frame to maximize the host's profit. There were the potboys and the tapsters, often young men or boys, who ran endlessly between the cellar and the common room, carrying the heavy wooden jacks and leather tankards, their hands stained with spilled ale, their ears catching the low gossip of the road. There were the maids who swept the rushes from the floor, turned the meat on the iron spits, and washed the wooden trenchers in the scullery. And perhaps most importantly to the weary traveler, there was the ostler. A traveler's horse was their livelihood, their wealth, and their only means of escape if the road turned dangerous. Handing that animal over to a stranger was a profound act of trust. The ostler took the reins at the door. He led the exhausted beast out into the cold, dark courtyard and into the stables. He rubbed the horse down, checked its hooves for stones, and fed it the oats and hay the traveler had purchased at a steep premium.
It was a vital, difficult job, done in the freezing dark, and it was notoriously corrupt. Ostlers were constantly accused of shorting the horses' feed, mixing the oats with chaff, or stealing the good hay to sell elsewhere. This was the working household of the medieval inn. It was an ecosystem built entirely around the temporary, vulnerable presence of strangers. The labor was grueling. The hours were dictated by the sun and the arrival of the last desperate rider. When the final guest had climbed the wooden stairs and the fire had burned down to embers, the host would sit by the dying light of a tallow candle, counting the cut silver pennies, balancing the day's intake against the cost of grain and wood. And long before the guests woke, the alewife would be back in the brewhouse, the maids would be hauling water, and the ostler would be checking the stables.
There is a quiet, eerie resonance to this reality. The traveler sat by the fire, feeling the profound relief of shelter and the warmth of the hot pottage, believing they had found a sanctuary. And they had. But that sanctuary was manufactured hour by hour by the relentless, invisible labor of real hands. The scrape and drop of the door latch was the sound of a traveler finding salvation. To the host, it was the sound of a transaction beginning. The scrape and drop, the pot stirred, the ale poured, the horse led to the stable. The inn was a business. The host prospered, building a substantial establishment like the Tabard, sometimes rising to sit in Parliament. The servants worked long, hard hours for little more than their keep and a few pennies a year. The guest paid for everything. It was a perfectly ordinary, entirely necessary commercial enterprise, and the warm evening they sold to the traveler was, underneath, a careful, coolly calculated exchange. The host smiled, the fire cracked, and the silver changed hands in the dark. From today's view, an inn is a service industry, a place where hospitality is a professional standard delivered by employees on a shift. From their view, it was a precarious, profit-driven household running late into the night, where the warmth of the welcome disguised the relentless, calculating work that kept the dark at bay. And that's what's so chilling.
England, the late 14th century. The fire in the common room has burned down to a low, red glow in the ashes. The last wooden cup has been emptied, the dice have been put away, and the host has collected the silver. It is time to sleep. A traveler, heavy with exhaustion and weak ale, walks up the wooden stairs into the dark of the upper chambers. He does not carry a key. He does not look for a door with a number on it. He is directed by a servant into a large, cold room, and he is pointed toward a massive wooden bed frame stuffed with a mattress of straw. The bed is wide enough to hold 3 or 4 men at once, and he is not the first one in it. The traveler takes off his boots, keeping his clothes on against the cold, and he climbs in. Listen to the reality of the arrangement. He is lying down next to a merchant he spoke to briefly by the fire, a mercenary whose name he does not know, and a third man who arrived late and said nothing at all. They pull a single, heavy wool blanket over themselves. And the worst part isn't the smell of the unwashed bodies or the rough straw pricking through the linen sheet. The worst part is the absolute, quiet vulnerability of the dark. When the fire had burned low and the talk had died and it was time to rest, the traveler discovered the last and strangest truth of the medieval inn. He did not get a room. In most inns, he did not even get a bed to himself. He got a place in a bed, a large bed shared with other travelers, sometimes several of them, strangers he had met only that evening, lying down together top to tail in the dark. And so the most vulnerable a medieval person ever was, asleep,
in the dark, with everything he owned on his body, he was, at the inn, in the company of strangers whose names he barely knew and whose intentions he could not guess. It is why so many travelers slept badly. It is why so many slept with a hand on the purse beneath their head. The warmest door on the road had brought him at last to the most defenseless hour of his journey. To understand the dread of the shared bed, we have to look closely at the physical reality of medieval lodging. Privacy as a concept barely existed outside the highest echelons of the nobility. The architecture of the ordinary world was communal. In a peasant household, the entire family, and often the livestock, slept in a single room. The inn simply took this domestic norm and commercialized it. If you were poor, you paid a fraction of a penny to sleep on a straw pallet on the floor of the common room or out in the stables with the horses. If you could afford a bed in a chamber, you bought a space, not the furniture. You climbed in beside men who might be honest tradesmen or who might be thieves. You lay on your back, staring at the timber ceiling, listening to the heavy, rhythmic breathing of people who owed you nothing. The primary danger, the fear that kept travelers staring into the dark long after the candle was blown out, was not necessarily violence, it was theft.
The medieval traveler was, by necessity, a walking bank. There were no letters of credit for the common man. If you were traveling to buy wool or returning from selling a harvest, you carried your wealth in hammered silver coins in a leather purse tied to your belt. Every stranger in the bed knew this, and you knew that they knew it. The court records of the period are filled with the grim, mundane aftermath of the shared bed. Men waking in the gray light of dawn to find their bedfellow gone and their purse cut from their belt. This constant low-level threat of robbery produced a profound physical vigilance. You did not take off your clothes, both for warmth and so you could not be easily separated from them. You unbuckled your heavy purse and you placed it directly beneath your head, using it as a hard, uncomfortable pillow, so that any attempt to take it would wake you. You kept your hand resting softly on the leather. You lay rigid, your muscles tense, hyper-aware of every shift in the straw mattress, every movement of the man beside you. And beneath the fear of the cut-purse was a darker, quieter terror, the fear of the armed stranger, and the fear of the host himself. The man sleeping next to you almost certainly carried a knife, a necessity for eating and for defense on the road. The close proximity of armed strangers in the dark, breathing the same air, sharing the same blanket, was an inherently volatile situation. But the deeper unease lay with the man who owned the bed. The host, as we saw in the previous hours, was a figure of authority and calculation. He had taken your silver, he had watered your ale, he had smiled at you across the fire, and now he held the keys to the heavy outer doors. In the popular imagination of the medieval world, and occasionally in the grim reality of the coroner's rolls, the innkeeper was not just a shrewd businessman, he was a predator. There are documented cases from the 14th and 15th centuries of innkeepers acting in league with highwaymen, noting which guests carried heavy lockboxes and sending word to the woods ahead of their departure. There are rarer, darker records of hosts who robbed their guests in the night, slipping into the chambers while the travelers slept heavily from the weak ale and the exhaustion of the road. These genuine scattered cases birthed a massive, enduring folklore. The legends whispered of beds built over trapdoors, of guests dropped into cellars to be murdered for their gold, of pies made from the flesh of the unwary, a lurid mythology that would eventually crystallize into the Victorian tale of Sweeney Todd. We must cleanly separate the documented reality from the legend.
The daily reality was not a nightly murder. Most hosts were simply businessmen extracting a profit. But to the traveler lying awake in the dark, the distinction between legend and reality did not matter. The fear was rational. You were far from home, locked inside a heavy timber building, entirely dependent on the honesty of a man whose primary interest in you was your money. The short measure of the ale in the evening was a small theft, you could see. But what might the host do in the dark when you could not?
For one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. And in the shared bed, that belonging was absolute. You were physically surrendered to the house and its occupants. The latch lifts. A pause. The latch drops. Even in the deep night, the sound carries up from the door below. Another late arrival. Another stranger stepping out of the cold and into the house. The sound does not bring comfort, it brings a fresh wave of vigilance. Will the host send the new arrival up to this chamber? Will the stranger climb into this very bed, bringing the freezing air of the road with him, displacing the fragile warmth beneath the blanket? This was the true, quiet dread of the medieval inn. It was not a rendered scene of violence. It was the long, wakeful hour of vulnerability. It was the exhaustion that demanded sleep, fighting against the instinct that demanded watchfulness. It was the physical weight of a stranger's leg against yours. It was the smell of damp straw and stale sweat. It was the creeping cold and the hard lump of the coin purse beneath your neck. The inn had promised refuge, and it had delivered it. The door was locked against the wolves and the outlaws of the open road. The fire had warmed you, the pottage had fed you, but the price of that shelter was this wary, wakeful dark. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. The comfort of the evening and the terror of the night were locked together in this single massive wooden frame. You lie still. You listen to the creak of the house settling as the temperature drops. You listen to the merchant beside you snore, a heavy, rattling sound. You wait for the dawn. From today's view, a shared bed with armed strangers is an unimaginable violation of privacy and safety, a nightmare of vulnerability. From their view, it was simply the cost of a roof, a necessary, uneasy surrender to the dark, where you trusted a stranger not to kill you, because the road outside certainly would. And that's what's so chilling.
England, the late 14th century. The heavy timber frame of the inn creaks softly as the temperature outside begins to plunge. Up in the shared chambers, the darkness is nearly absolute. A traveler lies awake on a wide straw mattress. He listens to the wind rattling the wooden shutters. He feels the hard, unforgiving shape of his leather coin purse tucked carefully beneath his head. He hears the slow, rhythmic, heavy breathing of the two strangers sharing the bed beside him. And the worst part isn't the coarse wool of the blanket, or the lingering taste of the host's watered ale, or the quiet, pulsing fear of the armed men sleeping in the room. The worst part is the profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude that washes over him in the dark. For 8 chapters, we have looked at the shadow of the medieval inn. We have seen the calculated business of the host, the short measure poured by the alewife, the wary sociability of the hearth, and the deep vulnerability of the shared bed. But beneath all the wariness, beneath the law and the legendary fears, there was a reason the traveler crossed the threshold. There was a reason the inn existed, and there was a reason the traveler paid his silver. Because whatever the inn cost in vigilance, it gave back something far more valuable. It offered 3 small, genuine human mercies,
And for a person alone on a dangerous road, those mercies were the difference between surviving the night and disappearing into the dark. The first mercy was the fire and the food. It is difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp the profound physical toll of medieval travel. To walk or ride from sunrise to sunset in the 14th century was to subject the human body to a grueling endurance test. The roads were deeply rutted, often turning to thick, clinging mud that doubled the weight of a man's boots. The rain soaked through heavy wool cloaks, settling a damp, unshakable chill deep into the bones. The traveler burned thousands of calories simply trying to stay upright and moving forward against the wind. By the time the light failed, the body was hollowed out. It was shivering, it was exhausted, it was entirely depleted. And then, out of the dusk came the inn. The traveler pushed open the heavy oak door and was met with a wall of heat. The stone hearth was massive, stacked with thick logs of ash and oak, were sometimes glowing with the intense, localized heat of sea coal. It was a purely physical kindness. You walked toward the light, you found a space on a rough wooden bench, you took off your soaked leather boots and extended your numb feet toward the flames. The heat radiated outward, baking the dampness from your tunic, slowly drawing the ache out of your overworked muscles. The fire was freely sold to anyone with a coin, but the relief it provided was miraculous. It was the return of feeling to cold fingers. It was the cessation of shivering.
Then the host or a servant would bring the bowl. The pottage was thick, heavy, and hot. It was not a banquet, and it was never meant to be. It was sustenance. The steam rising from the wooden bowl carried the smell of boiled oats, peas, salt pork, and wood smoke. You broke the coarse, dark bread and dipped it into the broth. The first mouthful traveled down a throat dry with the dust of the highway, settling into a hollow stomach with a deep, heavy weight. The weak, cloudy ale in the wooden cup washed it down, providing a mild, sedative warmth that loosened the tight muscles in the back of the neck. This was the first mercy. The inn did not just offer a transaction, it offered restoration. The hands of the host, the endless labor of the alewife in the brewhouse, the servants who turned the spits and carried the bowls, their work coalesced into this 1 hour by the fire. For all the host's shrewd calculation, the food he provided was hot, and the fire he built was large. It was the simplest and deepest comfort the medieval world had to offer. And for many travelers, this slow, quiet thawing by the hearth was the best part of the entire journey. The second mercy was the company of strangers. If the road took a physical toll on the body, it took a heavier psychological toll on the mind. The medieval wilderness was terrifying. It was an isolating, vast, and silent expanse. When you walked the muddy tracks through the deep woods, you walked alone with your fears. The trees hid outlaws, the bogs hid unmarked graves. The silence of the open country amplified every snapped twig and every rustle of leaves into a potential ambush. The loneliness of travel was a crushing, heavy weight, a constant reminder of how small and vulnerable a single human life was in an unforgiving landscape. The inn provided the absolute antidote to that isolation. When the traveler stepped through the door, the terrifying silence of the road was instantly replaced by a wall of human sound. You sat by the fire, and you were not alone. To your left might be a mason traveling to a new cathedral site. To your right might be a wool merchant down from the northern pastures, or a pardoner with a bag of questionable relics, or a local farmer who had just come in from the fields. You did not know them,
You had every reason, as the church warned and the law suspected, to be wary of them. They might cheat you at dice, or they might eye the purse at your belt. But in the warm, smoky air of the common room, they were also just people. They were other living, breathing human faces illuminated by the firelight. The low hum of their voices was a tether to sanity. You listened to them talk of the weather, of the price of grain, of the state of the road ahead. You listened to a quiet song pass from one bench to another. You watched the simple, ordinary rattle of bone dice on a wooden board.
This was the social friction that the preachers condemned as the devil's chapel. But to the frightened traveler, it was a profound defense against the dark. The sheer proximity of other human beings diluted the terror of the night. For a few hours, the isolating bubble of the journey was pierced. You were part of a temporary, fragile community. The human warmth of the company of strangers held the vast, empty world at bay. You sat among them, drinking the ale, listening to the voices, and feeling the quiet, steady reassurance that you were not the only soul left alive in the dark. And then came the third mercy, the deepest of all, and the one the whole night had been building toward, the shelter of the roof. When the fire finally burned down to red embers and the host called for the reckoning, the traveler climbed the stairs to the dark upper chambers. He found his place in the massive wooden bed. He lay down beside the armed strangers he had met only hours before. He clutched his coin purse beneath his head. He felt the quiet, wakeful dread of a man who knows he is entirely defenseless. But as he lay there, staring into the blackness, listening to the wind howl against the timber walls, another realization slowly began to take hold. The wind was outside. The freezing rain was outside. The desperate, lawless men who made their living in the deep woods were outside. The scrape and drop of the door latch sounds one final time from the room below. But this time it is not the sound of a stranger entering. It is the sound of the host dropping the heavy iron bolt into place, locking the great oak door for the night. The inn is full. The house is sealed. The dark is shut out. Whatever the dangers of the shared bed, whatever the unease of sleeping next to a man whose name you did not know, the inn delivered the one thing it truly promised. It kept the night out. A roof and a shared blanket among wary strangers was infinitely safer than a wet ditch by the side of the highway. The inn placed a physical barrier of oak, iron, wattle, and daub between the fragile human body and the lethal elements of the medieval world. The traveler listened to the heavy breathing of the stranger beside him. Earlier in the evening, that sound was a source of tension. Now, as exhaustion overtook him, it became a strange sort of comfort. The man beside him was armed, yes, but he was also asleep. He was another tired body seeking warmth. The bed was crowded, but it was dry. The room was dark, but it was secure. This was the hard bargain of the medieval inn, seen at last from the side of what it gave. You surrendered your autonomy. You paid your silver. You accepted the watered ale, the watchful host, and the suspect company. But in exchange, you bought your life for the night. You bought safety enough to close your eyes. For one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. And in the deepest hours of the dark, that belonging was finally resolved into peace. To belong to the inn meant you were warmed by its fire. It meant you were fed by its pot. It meant you were kept company by its guests and sheltered by its heavy timber roof. The tension slowly leaves the traveler's muscles. The grip on the leather purse beneath his head softens, just slightly. The breathing in the room falls into a slow, steady rhythm. The house settles into the earth. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. But the warmth had won. The shelter was real. The comfort and the company and the roof were worth the wariness, worth the silver, worth the fear. The traveler took the bargain, and at long last he slept. The fire turns to gray ash. The sign creaks outside in the wind. The world shrinks to the size of a single, silent room, suspended safely above the mud and the danger of the highway. From today's view, a bowl of hot stew, a crowded room, and a spot in a shared bed is a poor excuse for hospitality, a rough and uncomfortable way to spend a night. From their view, it was a trio of small, miraculous mercies, a genuine sanctuary of warmth, company, and shelter that carried them safely through the terrifying dark. And that's what's so gently, quietly beautiful.
England, the turn of the 19th century. The deep, impassable mud of the medieval highway has slowly given way to turnpikes and carefully graded toll roads. The great age of the stagecoach is at its zenith, and the rhythm of the journey has fundamentally changed. A traveler pulls into the courtyard of a massive brick-built coaching inn at twilight. The architecture is grand, imposing, and highly organized. There are sweeping wooden galleries running along the upper floors, enclosing a wide cobbled yard designed specifically to accommodate the turning radius of a 4-horse coach. Dozens of fresh horses wait in the extensive stabling blocks for the next stage of the journey. The traveler does not sleep in a shared bed. They rent a private room with a wash basin and a heavy lock on the door. They do not drink small ale brewed that morning by the host's wife. They drink hopped beer delivered by a commercial brewery or a glass of port from a heavily inventoried cellar. The journey is scheduled, ticketed, and relatively safe. And the worst part isn't the speed of the travel or the loss of the old slow rhythm of the road. The worst part is the quiet realization of what had to disappear for this new modern hospitality to exist. The medieval inn never really ended. It simply, slowly, across hundreds of years, became something else. As the centuries turned and travel by road grew from a rare, terrifying necessity into a common commercial enterprise, the inns grew with it. They expanded into the great coaching hostelries of the Tudor, Stuart, and Georgian ages, transforming from single wooden houses into sprawling complexes that dominated the centers of provincial market towns. And then, over a long expanse of time, the single medieval house that had been all things at once, alehouse and eating house and lodging and social club and news exchange, slowly separated into the distinct, specialized institutions we know now. The pub, where you go only to drink, the hotel, where you go only to sleep, the restaurant, where you go only to eat. The shared bed with strangers quietly vanished into history. The alewife's domestic homebrew gave way to the great industrial vats of the city breweries. The ale taster hung up his wooden cup for the last time, and the warm, dangerous, welcoming door on the dark road became at last something safe, regulated, and entirely ordinary. But the sign over it never quite came down. To understand the end of the medieval inn, we must look at how its dangers were systematically dismantled. The medieval inn was defined by its dual nature. It was the warmest door on the road, and it was also the one you had most reason to fear. The history of European hospitality over the following 5 centuries is essentially the history of that fear being steadily, deliberately removed by the march of progress. The most profound and intimate change was the death of the shared bed.
The intense, uncomfortable vulnerability of sleeping next to an armed stranger in the dark was a necessity born of medieval architecture, limited space, and crushing poverty. As the middle class expanded in the 16th and 17th centuries, and as modern notions of individualism and privacy began to firmly take hold, the demand for separate chambers grew. Travelers who were used to private bedrooms in their own homes were no longer willing to endure the indignity and the risk of the communal mattress.
The great straw-stuffed wooden frames were gradually dismantled by innkeepers adapting to a changing market. They were replaced first by smaller beds holding only 2 people, and eventually by private rooms entirely. The traveler no longer had to sleep in their clothes. They no longer had to use a heavy leather coin purse as an uncomfortable, unyielding pillow. The primary dread of the medieval night, the wakeful, rigid vigil against the thief in the bed, the fear of the stranger's knife, the anxiety of the dark room, simply faded away. The shelter remained, but the vulnerability was engineered out of the experience. The drink changed, too, and with it an entire domestic industry vanished. The introduction of hopped beer from the continent in the late medieval and early Tudor period fundamentally altered the brewing landscape. For centuries, the unhopped small ale had to be brewed locally because it spoiled in a matter of days. But the hop flower acted as a powerful natural preservative. Hopped beer could be kept for months. It could be stored in massive wooden casks. It could be loaded onto carts and shipped across the country. This technological shift marked the slow, inevitable decline of the local alewife and her domestic brewhouse. The production of the everyday drink moved out of the hot, smoke-filled kitchens of ordinary women and into massive, centralized, male-dominated commercial factories. The old Assize of bread and ale and the local ale tasters who walked the wards checking the wooden measures were gradually replaced by national taxation, excise officers, and standardized glass pints. The short measure and the foul drink still existed, of course, but the intimate, local, face-to-face scale of the fraud was gone. The drink became a reliable, manufactured commodity rather than a fragile local craft. And as the dangers faded, so did the absolute authority of the host. The medieval innkeeper, the man like Harry Bailey, had been a master of logistics and a shrewd judge of men, a man who held your life and your silver in his hands while you slept. He was a ruler of a small wooden kingdom. But as the roads grew safer, as the law extended its reach, and as the great coaching inns adopted strict corporate standards, the host became a manager. He became a proprietor. The cutthroat innkeeper of legend, the figure who haunted the medieval imagination and sparked 100 lurid fireside tales, receded into folklore, surviving only in the pages of Victorian penny dreadfuls and ghost stories. The great everything house splintered. If a traveler today wants a bed, they go to a hotel, a place designed almost exclusively for sleeping, with long, quiet corridors, electronic key cards, and a lobby specifically designed to ensure privacy. If they want food, they go to a restaurant, where they sit at an isolated table, speaking only to the people they arrived with. If they want a drink and company, they go to the public house, the pub, the direct, specialized descendant of the medieval alehouse. This separation brought unprecedented safety, privacy, and standardized comfort to the traveler. It made the journey predictable. But it also broke the profound, uneasy community of the medieval night. The traveler was no longer forced to share a fire with the knight, the miller, and the merchant. They no longer shared a single boiling pot of pottage. For one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. That belonging was inherently dangerous, but it was also a deep, forced human connection that the private hotel room eventually permanently erased.
The isolation of the modern journey replaced the perilous community of the old road.
Yet, for all that was lost, for all the specialized comfort that replaced the warm, dangerous door, the physical remnants of the medieval inn stubbornly refused to disappear. Across Britain today, if you know where to look, the architecture of that vanished world still stands, quietly hiding in plain sight. There are hundreds of pubs and inns that trace their foundations back to the 14th, 13th, and even 12th centuries. Buildings like the George in Southwark, the last surviving galleried coaching inn in London, sitting just yards from where the Tabard once stood, hint at the immense scale of the old hostelries. Places like the Trip to Jerusalem in Nottingham, carved directly into the soft sandstone beneath the castle, or the Bell in Hurley, or the Mermaid in Rye, claim to have served travelers since the days of the Crusades. While the specific claims of being the oldest are often fiercely contested by historians and heavily marketed by breweries, the physical fabric of the buildings is undeniably, tangibly real. The ceilings in these surviving buildings are famously low, supported by heavy, uneven oak beams that have turned pitch black from centuries of wood smoke and tobacco. The walls lean at impossible angles, the wattle and daub slowly settling into the earth over hundreds of years. The hearths are massive, built of ancient, heat-cracked stone that has held a fire nearly every winter night since the Wars of the Roses. The thresholds at the doorways have been worn into deep, smooth hollows by the passage of countless boots, the physical, eroded memory of 1,000,000 travelers stepping in out of the dark. And above the door, the sign still hangs. It is no longer a green bush of ivy tied to the end of a wooden ale stake. It is a painted board, suspended on an ornate iron bracket, but it serves the exact same purpose it served in 1386. The White Hart, the Red Lion, the Blue Boar, the Golden Cross, the Swan. These signs are the direct, unbroken descendants of the medieval heraldry of hospitality. They were designed for a world that could not read, and they have survived into a world that no longer needs them, swinging in the wind, groaning on their iron hinges, a permanent marker calling the weary traveler in. The scrape and drop of the door latch still sounds. You can walk into one of these old buildings today. You can cross the hollowed stone threshold. You can order a drink, walk across the uneven floorboards, and sit down on a wooden bench beside a massive stone hearth. The danger is entirely gone. The bed upstairs is private, clean, and secure. The drink is heavily regulated by trading standards, and the host will not cut your purse while you sleep. The warm, dangerous door is now only a warm door, offering a safe, nostalgic evening out. But the fundamental human need that built the inn in the first place remains exactly the same. The modern traveler is still tired. The night outside is still dark. The rain is still cold. The profound bodily relief of finding a lit room, a hot fire, and the low, comforting murmur of other human voices at the end of a long journey has not changed a fraction in 700 years. When you sit by the fire in a genuinely old inn today, you are participating in an unbroken chain of comfort. You were sitting exactly where a frightened, exhausted, mud-spattered medieval traveler sat, seeking exactly the same sanctuary. The warmth on your face is the same warmth they felt. The sound of the wind rattling the glass is the same sound they heard through the oiled cloth. The fire settles into the ashes. The quiet murmur of voices fills the low-beamed room. The long, strange, dangerous history of the medieval inn, the alewife brewing in the smoke, the ale-taster checking the seal, the heavy breathing in the shared bed, the cutthroat host tallying his silver, the preacher's dire warnings, and the cold, terrifying road outside fades quietly into the worn wood and the old stone. The institution evolved.
The dangers were defeated, and the world moved on, but the walls remained to offer shelter to anyone with a coin. From today's view, a quiet pint in an old timber-framed pub is a charming piece of living history, a comfortable, perfectly safe, and slightly romanticized evening out. From their view, it was the absolute hard-fought triumph of the sanctuary over the dark, the slow, centuries-long transformation of a terrifying necessity into a safe, warm, and welcoming room that would outlast them all. And that's what's so chilling. London, the summer of 2026. In a quiet, deeply silent, climate-controlled reading room at the National Archives in Kew, a fragile piece of the medieval night rests on a gray foam support. It is a roll of vellum from a 14th-century manor court. The room smells of dry paper, old dust, and filtered air. Under the soft, white glare of a modern desk lamp, the Latin script is small, precise, and faded to the color of dried leaves. The ink records a mundane piece of local administration. It lists a fine of 3 pence levied against an alewife named Alice, who lived in a village in the south of England, for selling a short measure of small ale to a traveler. The ink has outlasted Alice. It has outlasted her domestic brewhouse, her wooden measuring cups, the local ale taster who caught her, and the weary, unnamed traveler who drank her thin, cloudy ale by the fire. The law that watched the medieval inn has crumbled into archival dust, preserved under glass and handled by historians wearing white cotton gloves. But the truest archive of this long, dark history is not made of parchment. It is made of oak and iron and stone, and it still stands out in the weather. Across the city, in Southwark, the morning traffic grinds heavily down Borough High Street. The sprawling, dangerous, lawless suburb of the medieval era has been swallowed entirely by the modern metropolis. The Tabard Inn, where Harry Bailey once ruled and Chaucer's pilgrims once gathered, is gone. It burned in the great Southwark fire of 1676, was rebuilt, and finally demolished in the 19th century. Today, its location is marked only by a blue historical plaque pinned to a modern brick wall. But if you turn away from the plaque, step off the loud pavement of the high street, and walk down a narrow, shadowed alleyway just a few yards away, the centuries immediately begin to fall away. At the end of the alley stands the George. It is the last surviving galleried coaching inn in London. While the current timber frame was rebuilt shortly after the 17th century fire, it stands on original medieval foundations, occupying the exact footprint of the ancient hostelry that came before it. Its low, heavy architecture is a physical shock against the glass and steel of the modern city. The galleries stretch out over a wide, cobbled courtyard. The timber beams are painted pitch black, leaning at soft, uneven angles as the building slowly settles into the damp London earth. And above the entrance, bolted to the heavy wooden facade, the sign still hangs. It is a painted board on an iron bracket. It is the direct, unbroken descendant of the ale stake and the ivy bush, the ancient heraldry of hospitality designed for a world that could not read. In the cool air of the morning, a slight breeze catches the heavy board. It swings just a fraction of an inch. It creaks softly on its hinges. You walk across the courtyard. The cobblestones are damp with the morning dew. You step up to the main door. The stone threshold beneath your boots has been worn into a deep, smooth, permanent hollow by the friction of 1,000,000 leather soles, 1,000,000 heavy boots crossing out of the dark and into the light. You reach out. You rest your hand against the rough, cold iron.
The latch lifts. A pause. The latch drops. It is the sound small and heavy and perfect.
It is the exact same mechanical sequence of sounds that took in 7 centuries of frightened, exhausted travelers, shutting out the wind, the outlaws, and the vast, terrifying emptiness of the medieval road. It is ours to lift today. Inside the inn, the air is quiet. It does not smell of wet wool or unwashed bodies or the sharp tang of wood smoke and spoiled ale. It smells of polished mahogany, floor wax, and the faint, comforting aroma of roasted coffee. But the bones of the room are exactly as they were. The ceilings are impossibly low, crossed by massive, hand-hewn oak beams. The walls are thick. The windows are small, allowing the morning sunlight to filter into the room in long, pale, dusty shafts. At the end of the room sits the hearth. It is massive, built of stone, the brickwork inside blackened by hundreds of years of winter fires. The people who built this world and the people who sought refuge in it left very little behind. The wealthy merchant, the tired mercenary, the ordinary peddler, the silent cook, the shrewd host counting his silver by rushlight, they are all gone. The alewife is gone. The ale taster is gone. The host who watered the drink is gone. We do not have their names. We do not have their voices. They spent 100,000 nights in shared beds, lying rigid in the dark, clutching leather purses, listening to the heavy breathing of strangers. They woke in the gray dawn, paid their reckoning, and walked back out onto the muddy roads, leaving no trace of their passage except the slight deepening of the hollow in the stone step. They were so incredibly vulnerable, and they found their only comfort in these dark, timbered rooms. For centuries, this building, and thousands of buildings just like it across the countryside, represented a profound, necessary compromise. It was the warmest door on the road. It was also the one you had most reason to fear. The host who held the keys, the stranger who shared the blanket, the cut-purse waiting in the dark, they defined the medieval night. The shelter was real, but the price of that shelter was a quiet, unshakable dread. But time acts as a slow, merciful filter. The centuries washed the danger away. The cutthroat host vanished into a ghost story. The shared bed was dismantled and forgotten. The short measure was corrected by the law. The fear that kept the traveler awake in the dark evaporated into the morning air. What survived was only the good half of the bargain. What survived was the warmth. The shelter remained, the roof remained, the deeply human need to step out of the cold, to sit by a lit fire, and to share a drink in the company of other faces remained. We still cross these ancient thresholds. We still order a cup of ale. We still find an empty wooden bench by the hearth, and we sit down, letting the exhaustion of the day drain slowly from our legs. And for one night, under a stranger's roof, you belonged to the inn. The long history of the medieval night is over. The fire has burned down to soft white ash. The ghosts of the Tabard and the wary travelers of the dark road have finally been allowed to rest. The sun is fully up now. The light is warm against the old timber. The warm door is still open, no longer dangerous, calling the traveler in from the road. The night is gone. The morning has come. The road waits. Sleep well.